Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program Stephan Sieber, who's CEO of Transporeon. And today we're going to talk about the way forward in transportation management. Now, in case you were in doubt, this past year taught us that the rules for success moving forward are not going to be the same as those in the past. And that's certainly true in transportation management. In research that we recently conducted in partnership with Transporeon, we surveyed over 300 shippers, carriers, and other industry stakeholders, and we asked them, how much room for improvement do you believe still exists in transportation management processes? So, what did the respondents say? What are some of the desired outcomes moving forward? And how can technology help the industry achieve these outcomes? Well, that's going to be the key focus of our conversation today. And it's great to have Stephan on the program to share his insights and perspective and advice on this topic. So, Stephan, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Adrian. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, likewise. And certainly it's hard to believe that, we were all looking forward to 2020 to come to an end, and put that behind us. And we're already into February here. But certainly, like I said, there's certainly been some key lessons learned, from the past year. So maybe as a way to get started, as you reflect back on 2020, as you've had conversations with, shippers and carriers and the like, I mean, what do you see as the key lessons learned that both shippers and carriers must embrace and apply moving forward?
So I would say, like when we look back to 2020 and sort of the two phases of the year, right? I mean, I discount the first 2-3 months because the year really started for us in Europe in calendar week 12 when we sort of got hit here locally, right? We saw it coming from Asia, and then a couple of weeks later, we've seen it moving over to the US. But sort of those two phases, it's all about, for me, real-time insight and the ability to act. And when I say real-time insight, it's not only real-time visibility, knowing where your transports, your trucks, your ships are, but it's sort of understanding the market dynamics more or less in real time. But then even more important, the ability to do something with that insight, to act and react, because we've gone through, and the whole world has gone through, phases of unprecedented change and volatility and ambiguity.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think one of the things that, for me is, for a long time, analysts like myself talked about the importance of flexibility, agility, responsiveness, right? And these were all words, right? These are all adjectives. These are all things that I think many shippers and carriers kind of heard, but maybe didn't walk the talk and didn't quite fully understand, the meaning of those things or the importance of those things. And like you said, once the pandemic hit, and it was the same for us here in the United States, right? It was really kind of that March, April timeframe that those companies that had that visibility, those companies that had the ability to derive insights from data were the ones that were in the best position to kind of react, right?
And I think it was also interesting to see how, our customers on both shipper and carrier side reacted in a different way when the first wave hit us in March, April, compared to sort of when the second wave came in November, October, November, some parts even December. And then, some parts of the world, specifically Europe, we on top in the second wave had this little thing called Brexit that added additional complexity, right? But the first wave was really about everybody just tried to survive, right? I mean, factories were shut here in Europe, borders were closed. We felt, like being 60, 70 years back before the European Union sort of, or probably 30 years back before the European Union really started to open borders. And everybody just tried to somehow make sure that things move from A to B. And then in the second wave, it became much more of a dynamic sort of, step by step moving forward, and things like understanding capacity and price indices and sort of adapting transport assignment strategies on a very short term became much more important. So for example, we've seen a massive increase of spot tenders on our tendering platform compared to strategic tenders, because many shippers were just uncertain about the future. They didn't want to commit for long term. They didn't want to lock themselves in. We've seen an increase, an overall increase in the spot market compared to the contracted market. So it felt like everybody was using more of those digital tools that gives them responsiveness, flexibility, agility, exactly what you pointed out.
That's a great point, and we've seen a similar trends here in terms of the split between the spot market and the contracted market. Similar trends here as well. And you brought up another great point. It's very easy to kind of hyper focus on COVID, but the reality is that shippers and carriers have other challenges and issues to deal with, whether it's the hyper rise of e-commerce, which of course the pandemic helped to fuel as well. But at your end, Brexit was another thing that had been years in the making, if you will, but it was another added complexity and added challenge that those particularly overseas had to deal with. But it obviously has a ripple effect. Since all supply chains are global, what happens with regards to Brexit also impacts companies around the world. So I think the bottom line is that, one of the key lessons learned is, like I said in my opening comments, is that there's still a lot of challenges out there in the industry. And in fact, in the survey that I referenced in the research that we partnered with, almost 2/3 of the respondents said that they believe that a large or very large room for improvement still exists in transportation management processes. What are some of the symptoms of the waste and inefficiencies that still exist out there?
When you look at studies from, in North America, the American Transportation Research Institute, or the equivalents here in Europe, they all point out that despite all the efforts made in creating transparency, connecting parties to each other, there is still a significant amount of sort of idle capacity and waste in the processes, right? I think the American Transportation Research Institute points out that there is up to 20% empty miles among those 17 billion total operating miles in I guess that was a US or North American sort of perspective, right? And in Europe here, we have similar stats from Eurostat that point out it's between 15 to 30% empty journeys, right? Alone in Germany, we talk about more than 150 million empty runs per year, right? And then last but not least, we should also not forget that drivers, when they're being asked, they all sort of say that it's in between 2.5 to 3 hours of average waiting time for them, which is substantial if you look at the overall driving time they have, right? So that's sort of the economical side of the damage, and that comes directly also with an ecological side of the damage, because there is still quite a substantial part of CO2 emissions being produced without really shipping something from A to B. And overall, when we look at the European market here, we count with a European sort of land transport market of roughly 200 billion per annum. If we just say it's roughly 25 to 30% waste in these processes, it translates into 60 billion of euro damage per annum, right? And exactly the same stat you could apply to the US. So there is a substantial value that can be captured if we somehow get our act together and solve that problem, right?
Yeah, when you think about, so I've been an industry analyst now for over, 20 years, almost 22 years now. And, the problems you cited, empty miles, right? Detention time or waiting time, with drivers, certainly CO2 emissions, which is, over the years has gotten more and more attention. It's becoming, much more critical now, or an imperative for many companies to look for ways to reduce that carbon emissions. And obviously transportation plays a, key role there. Those are things that have been, problems for the past 20 years, right? So I know in the report that we published together, I kind of cite that quote from that's usually attributed to Einstein that says, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Well, from that perspective, transportation has been insane for a long time, because we've been doing kind of the same thing over and over again, and expecting different results, but yet we still have these issues in the industry, which I think is why a lot of the stakeholders that we talked about, that we surveyed, the shippers, the carriers, the 3PLs, and so forth, when they look at that, they say, "Yeah, absolutely, there's still a lot of room, for improvement there." So one of the things that we also did in the research is that we asked, the shippers and carriers, "Hey, if you were able to redesign or enable new transportation processes, what are your desired outcomes?" So why don't you share a little bit about what ended up topping the list, and were there any differences between shippers and carriers?
Absolutely, happy to do so. So I think overall, everybody agrees that having greater visibility into real-time demand, rates, and capacity is something that would help, right? Now, if you then drill a little bit down, of course, shippers and carriers, as well as logistics service providers like 3PLs overall have a slightly different view, right? Shippers really look at it in the sense of, you know, sort of how can they make sure that they get their stuff to the customers fast and reliably, whereas carriers more look at it from a perspective, how can I reduce or eliminate empty miles and waiting times, right? Which is not surprising, and somehow also sort of looking at the same things from two different perspectives. But that has been sort of throughout the whole report, a common theme. And then one area where I think shippers and the carrier side equally agree is that they all want to reduce manual efforts and paper-based or just broken communication chains. So, we really look at this as a call of the industry, of the players, for strong digital tools, platforms, and that's sort of also why I think the title of your report talks a lot about those network effects that I think we're all looking for.
Yeah, no, so certainly, I mean, I think, those desired outcomes, when I looked at the results, didn't surprise me either, right? So that whole visibility, from a shipper standpoint, it's about, they're facing more stringent, more demanding customer expectations with regards to, delivery. They're looking to compete on customer experience and so forth. So having greater visibility, more real-time visibility, like you talked about before, that agility, responsiveness, and so forth, kind of really depends on that flow of information and the ability to kind of match their need for capacity, more efficiently, with the carriers out there. And obviously, the
Agreed.
carriers are looking to operate their fleet, more efficiently, because they're facing other issues like, the ability to hire and retain, drivers, right? So that need becomes less critical if they're able to actually use the equipment and the drivers they have, more efficiently. So all those things, work hand in hand. Now you mentioned, network effects, and I argue in the report that shippers and carriers need to think in terms of network effects, moving forward. So what is, the power of the network, and why is it important to take that perspective?
Yeah, I think it's almost fair to say that, to some extent we were wrong when we said it's a chain, because it's not really a chain. It should be a network, right? And I think it's also important that today, with, on the one side, the tooling that is available to us, and with tooling I mean the fact that pretty much everybody can be connected to everybody instantaneously in real time, that data can be shared, and that data is available to support decision making. So that whole digital tooling that is there, but also with the market volatility in which we are living, not only in years like 2020 with a global pandemic and a country leaving the European Union for some parts of the world, but overall the market volatility in which we're just living, that it requires from all of us that we start to look at it more as a point-to-point network, where sort of the infinite collaboration of pretty much all the parties involved is possible, right? And to my, in my opinion, the tooling, as I said, the digital platforms that are there, that exist, like Transporeon, do allow shippers and carriers equally to take benefit of this, right? And that's also what you point out in your report. It forces all of us to change a little bit the perspectives and how we looked at things, and make use of that data that is there, make use of that real-time insight, which, as I said before, is not only the real-time visibility as we know it from supply chain visibility, telematics-based data aggregation where you can see where your truck is, but sort of also the ability to make use of that real-time insight in immediately adapting your assignment strategy, your sourcing strategy, or even down to very tactical things like dock scheduling, right? Changing the sequence of the trucks when they come to the yard, making sure that you pull forward the guy that is already in the waiting zone, and sort of swap the appointment with somebody that comes too late, just in a collective effort of the whole network to drive down and reduce this waste that we've talked about before.
Yeah, no, a lot of great points. I mean, you start out by saying, we almost have to move away from, thinking in terms of a supply chain. And I know it's so hard because that term supply chain is so entrenched. And even though I've advocated to move away from that term, it's always very difficult to, but you're right. I mean, that term kind of implies linear, and implies rigid, inflexible, so on and so forth, which is really the exact opposite of kind of today's operating, reality. And then we've seen the power of the network effects in so many other areas, right? Whether it's telecommunications, certainly even within the social networking, realm, in terms of the ability to easily connect with others, exchange information, and so forth. I think applying that model and that perspective into the B2B world, and specifically in transportation, I think opens the door to more efficiently and in a more scalable way achieve those desired outcomes that we talked about. So, I mean, you touched upon it a little bit already, but how can technology ultimately enable, this network effect? I mean, what capabilities will be most important moving forward?
Yeah, so I think it's, first of all, it's important to understand that a network, at least in the B2B world, and in that size and complexity and dynamics that we talk about in our market here, a network like this just doesn't appear, right? It needs to be sort of built, it needs to be facilitated, it needs to be orchestrated, and it all starts with tools and services that need to be provided, right? To bring parties and participants in a network together. And then a network also needs certain rules and standards, right? Now, what's a standard? What's a rule? If everybody follows a standard, it's almost like a rule. Sometimes these rules are written by a legislator or by a governance body, right? A governing body. Sometimes the rules are just established by the network because the participant in the network sort of decide that this is basically the standard behavior. And once you have this, there is a community and the network evolving, right? There is a community around those tools, services, rules, and standards that somehow agrees that this is the way we do business and we communicate to each other, we interact, etc. And once you have those three levels, well, then there comes the icing on the cake, which I always say is basically matchmaking, is helping the market, helping supply and demand to react more efficiently to each other, and overall helping the market to work better than without such a network, without such a platform in which or on which the network gets orchestrated, right? And that's basically what we see when we act with our customers on both shipper carrier side of the network, that this is basically the sequence that everybody tries to follow.
I liked how you talked about, the standard side of things, because I think that is critically, important to drive speed, to drive efficiency, to drive scalability. And certainly that's one of the key roles there of that the platform, plays, particularly from a connectivity standpoint. But then is the ability to then, once you've got that platform in place, once you've got those communication standards in place, and all the parties connected, then it's the ability to layer, the software on top of that, or the technology on top of that, to then enable workflows between all the different, parties, and the permissions and the security and everything else that goes,
Exactly.
Along with that. And in many ways, even though, platforms such as Transporeon have been around for a while already, I really think that the best is yet to come, if you will, because I think that a lot of companies are just now starting to recognize or understand what we mean when we talk about the network effect. And I think situations like what happened in 2020, certainly what happened in 2018, at least here in the United States, there was a lot of capacity crunch and so forth. These things are kind of, I think, finally bringing a lot of companies, both shippers and carriers, to recognize we've got to do things differently. We've got to leverage technology. We got to think about technology in different ways. And I think that's where, I see certainly, growing momentum, for the network effect, and, leveraging these types of platforms to, to achieve that. In fact, a few years ago, I wrote a blog post on Talking Logistics where I said, moving forward, or my hope is that, maybe in 5 years' time, we'll see, companies, instead of having chief supply chain officers, they'll have chief network effects officers. And I think if we get there, then I think we've reached the pinnacle of this opportunity. So Stephan, as a way to wrap up, then, I mean, how do you see, the network effect and platforms evolving, in the months and years ahead, and what actions should shippers and carriers take today to keep pace with these innovations?
Well, so I think, and I totally agree with what you said, right? I mean, 2020 and in the US with the capacity crisis in 2018, or similar events, in many ways, we could say, as hard as this might sound, right? This is accelerating things that needed to happen or that were going to happen anyway. They just, really accelerated those moves. So from that point of view, I think we should all take the past few months as sort of a learning, and do a critical review on our strategies so far, and say, like, what has turned out to be right and to be working, and what has also turned out to be suboptimal and with room for improvement. And I guess that's, when I look at the conversations we're having with, again, both shippers and carriers, what pretty much all our customers are doing at this point in time. And I always, give them sort of the advice, to, not look at digital transformation as an obligation, but much more as an opportunity. Don't think about what you have to do. Think about it in a way, what it can do for you, and what you could potentially think of being able to achieve if you were to have the right tooling, the right connectivity, the right insight, the right data available. And then you will find out that it is actually possible. Many things are possible that we probably a few years ago wouldn't have thought it is possible. And I do see that many of the vice presidents of supply chain, or whatever these titles are, even if they probably still carry that title, they do start to think about themselves as network people. And they do think about themselves as being part of this spider web that you describe in your report, where they are just, in a good way, just one dot in a massive network of interconnected parties that all together try to achieve something. We have great examples of horizontal integration between, starting really with aluminium and steel, going to the packaging industry, going to food and beverage, and then ultimately to retail, because they're all trying to solve one problem, right? And in the past, that problem was always faster, more reliable, and or cheaper, right? Those were the two options. You're either fast and reliable, or you're cheap. Now there is more and more, at least a third option coming, which is most sustainable, right? So then of course there are these guys that say we want sort of the optimal combination of those three factors. We want to have great customer service, reliable, predictable supply chains. We want to have a good cost performance, and we want to have a good ecological performance. And it is actually doable, right? So look at it as an opportunity rather than as an obligation. Think big, involve your partners, involve the other parties, the other dots in that spider web, and make use of digital tools.
Yeah, I love that advice. Think of it as an opportunity and not as an obligation. I think that's a great perspective, and you provided some great advice there. Well, Stephan, we just managed to scratch the surface, on this topic. I'm sure we could probably speak for another hour or so just on the results of the research that we did. So first, I want to thank you for making the time to be with us today, and sharing your insights and advice on this topic. And secondly, for those of you that are watching, If you're interested in getting more details around the research, you can visit the Transporeon website, and there you can register and download the report to, get more information around the survey results and some of the other, research findings from that. So again, Stephan, thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Well, thank you, Adrian. It was a pleasure to be with you. And thanks also for the collaboration throughout this report. It's certainly been an exciting work, and I'm looking forward to continue on that basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of those areas that certainly doing ongoing research to kind of see how the industry continues to evolve, and where those opportunities are for continued success and to achieve these desired outcomes. To keep a pulse on the industry, I think is going to be important moving forward. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the Talking Logistics website or on the Transporeon website, and you've got any questions or comments for Stephan, you can post it there, and he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.